The Galactic Council was full of laughter. King Aureus of the Xandor Empire had a problem. A big one. His daughter, Princess Lyra, was not what anyone expected from a royal heir. She had pale green skin, silver eyes that glowed in the dark, and hair that shimmered like stardust. But it wasn't just her appearance that bothered people. Lyra had strange powers. Powers that no one understood. Powers that scared people. And most importantly, powers that made her the last person anyone wanted to marry or associate with. King Aureus had always wanted a strong, beautiful daughter who could bring honor to his name. But Lyra, from the moment she was born, seemed to do the opposite. She had a gift that made everyone around her uneasy. She could communicate with animals and even read minds, a skill that made her even more of an outsider in a world where power was everything. Her ability to influence and control minds was dangerous, and it wasn't a trait the king wanted for his heir. The Galactic Council laughed at the king's expense. King Aureus was powerful, but even he couldn't fix the problem his daughter presented. His advisors had been telling him for years to marry her off to someone who would take her away from the palace, away from his sight. But no one wanted to marry Lyra. Every suitor rejected her, either out of fear of her powers or simply because she wasn't the perfect princess they'd hoped for. Aureus was tired of dealing with his daughter. The constant pressure from the Galactic Council to find a way to fix his daughter weighed on him. He had one last option, a human ambassador named Raylan Carter. Raylan had arrived on Xandor to discuss peace treaties between the human colonies and the Empire. The king saw an opportunity. He could give Lyra to this human as a gift, and get rid of her in the process. The council would find it hilarious, and perhaps they would stop mocking him for his failures as a father. The king called for Raylan to meet him in the royal chambers. Raylan was a tall, serious man, known for his diplomatic skills. He'd been on many missions across the galaxy, and he wasn't easily shocked by strange alien cultures. But when he entered the royal chambers, he wasn't expecting to be faced with such an unusual request. King Aureus leaned back in his throne, a smug look on his face. "Ambassador Carter," he began in his deep voice, "I have a request that I'm sure you will find interesting." Raylan raised an eyebrow, sensing something was off but kept his composure. "What is it, Your Majesty?" The king smiled. "I want you to take my daughter, Princess Lyra, as your charge. She is difficult to manage, and I believe she could learn much from someone of your experience." Raylan's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't show his surprise. "Your daughter, you want me to take her?" He glanced over at the princess, sitting quietly beside the king. Lyra's silver eyes met his, and for a moment he felt a strange shiver down his spine. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite place, but it wasn't what the king had said. It was the way she watched him, intensely and without fear. King Aureus laughed darkly, clearly amused by Raylan's hesitation. "Yes, I want you to take her. She is problematic. Perhaps you can find her a place in your human colonies, or perhaps she will be of use to you. She's quite special, you see." Raylan stood silent for a moment, processing the request. He had traveled across the stars to negotiate peace, not to become a guardian of a princess no one wanted. But as he looked back at Lyra, he noticed something unusual. Despite the strange air around her, there was a sadness in her eyes, a loneliness that made him feel a tug in his chest. She was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but her face showed no anger, only resignation. She was just waiting for something, perhaps someone, to notice her. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Raylan said slowly. "Why would you want to send her away? She's your daughter." The king's expression turned cold. "She is a burden. She does not fit into the role I had planned for her. She has no place in this empire." He looked at Lyra as if she was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Perhaps you will have more success with her than I have. She's not my problem anymore." Raylan knew there was more to this than the king was letting on, but he wasn't in a position to ask more questions. He was here to do his job, and a request from a king was not something one could easily refuse. Still, he felt uneasy about taking Lyra, especially after the king's harsh words. Lyra stood up suddenly, breaking the tense silence. She spoke for the first time in the meeting. "You do not need to take me," she said quietly. "I am not someone you need to deal with." Her voice was calm, almost emotionless, but Raylan could hear the pain underneath. She had already resigned herself to a life of being unwanted. Raylan didn't know why, but her words stirred something in him. He turned to the king. "I will take her, but I won't treat her as a burden." King Aureus barely nodded, already turning his attention elsewhere. He was done with this conversation. He had made his decision. The council would laugh, and Lyra would be gone. Raylan, however, wasn't sure if he had made the right choice, but something told him he needed to find out. As they left the palace together, Lyra kept her gaze forward, not speaking to Raylan. The two of them were about to enter a new chapter, one neither of them had expected. The human's surprise. Raylan Carter sat quietly in the small shuttle, staring out of the window at the stars. He had left the grand palace of Xandor behind, the laughter of the Galactic Council still echoing in his ears. The king had practically shoved his daughter, Princess Lyra, into his care with a cold and casual attitude. Raylan had thought it would be just another diplomatic mission, but the reality was far from simple. As the shuttle moved deeper into the galaxy, Raylan felt a strange tension in the air. He glanced over at Lyra, sitting across from him. She hadn't said a word since they left the palace. She was gazing out the window, her silver eyes reflecting the stars, as if she was searching for something out there in the endless space. Her pale green skin seemed to glow softly in the dim light of the shuttle, and her quiet presence felt oddly unsettling. Raylan had expected a princess to be full of grace, charm, and elegance, but Lyra was different. There was a coldness around her, an air of someone who had been abandoned and forgotten. But it wasn't just her looks. It was the way she held herself, guarded, distant. It was as if she had given up on expecting kindness from anyone. The silence between them was thick, and Raylan didn't know how to break it. He wasn't used to this. He was a diplomat, skilled at talking to anyone, no matter their species or background. But Lyra was unlike anyone he had ever met. He had been given no instructions on how to handle her, and the king had made it clear that Lyra was more of a problem than a princess. "What do you want from me?" Lyra's voice broke the silence, and Raylan turned to face her. Her silver eyes locked with his, and for the first time, she wasn't looking at him with the same cold, distant stare. There was something vulnerable in her gaze. Raylan blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "You're here because my father doesn't want me. You're here to take me away, but I don't belong to you." "I'm not a problem you can fix," Lyra said quietly. Her voice was calm, but Raylan could hear the sadness behind her words. Raylan didn't know how to respond. He had never dealt with someone who spoke so frankly about their pain. It was uncomfortable for him, but he couldn't ignore the truth in her words. He was supposed to take her to the human colonies, where she would probably be locked away in some palace or forgotten about completely. The thought made him uneasy, but he couldn't explain why. "I'm not here to fix you," Raylan said finally, his tone honest. "I'm not your father, and I'm not your enemy." Lyra turned her face away from him, staring out at the stars again. She didn't respond. Raylan could tell she didn't believe him. She had been hurt too many times before to trust anyone, especially a human. He had been told she was a burden, but the more he observed her, the more he realized that the truth was much more complicated. Lyra wasn't a burden. She was just someone who had been abandoned by everyone, including her own father. As the shuttle continued its journey through space, Raylan couldn't stop thinking about Lyra. There was something about her that made him want to protect her, something that told him she wasn't the monster everyone believed her to be. But what could he do? He was just a diplomat, nothing special. He wasn't equipped to care for a princess, especially one who was so different from everything he knew. Hours passed, and they finally arrived at the human colony where Raylan was supposed to take Lyra. The colony was a small outpost on the edge of human-controlled space. It was a quiet place where diplomats, traders, and explorers gathered. Raylan had been here many times, but this time felt different. He wasn't just coming for a peace negotiation or a treaty signing. This time, he was bringing someone who needed help, someone who had been abandoned and forgotten by her own people. Lyra stepped off the shuttle, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. She didn't look at Raylan, didn't acknowledge him at all. It was as if she was already preparing herself to be left alone again. Raylan felt a pang of guilt. He had promised the king to take her to this quiet colony, but he didn't want to just leave her here, to be forgotten like everyone else had done. He couldn't. "I'll show you around," Raylan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You'll be safe here. No one will hurt you." Lyra didn't respond. She just followed him as they walked through the small settlement, the sounds of the colony's workers and traders filling the air. The people didn't seem to notice the strange, glowing princess walking beside him. To them, Lyra was just another alien. But Raylan could tell that Lyra didn't belong here. She was out of place in a world where people had their own problems to deal with, and she was just a shadow of something that no one cared about. After they walked for a while, Raylan stopped at a small house on the edge of the colony. It was modest, nothing fancy. Just a simple home where Raylan had arranged for them to stay while he figured out what to do next. The door opened, and a human woman greeted them with a warm smile. "Ambassador Carter," the woman said, her voice cheerful. "You've brought company, I see." Raylan nodded, his eyes flicking to Lyra. "This is Princess Lyra. She'll be staying here for a while." The woman's smile faded slightly as she looked at Lyra. It wasn't fear, but uncertainty. Raylan could see it. Lyra stood there, silent and cold, as always. Raylan felt a heavy weight in his chest. He had no idea what he was supposed to do with her, and he had no idea how to make her trust him. But one thing was clear. Lyra's future was in his hands now, and Raylan wasn't sure if he was ready for that responsibility. A cold welcome. Raylan and Lyra stepped into the small house, the door creaking shut behind them. The air inside was warm, but the silence between them was cold, like a heavy fog that neither of them knew how to break. Raylan could hear the soft hum of the air system and the distant sounds of the colony outside, but all that mattered to him now was the princess standing stiffly beside him. Lyra's eyes scanned the room, her gaze sharp but distant. She didn't seem impressed by the simple furnishings. A worn couch, a small dining table, and a few chairs scattered around. The house wasn't much, but it was safe. It was quiet. It was the last place anyone would expect to find a princess who was abandoned by her own father. "Make yourself at home," Raylan said, trying his best to sound welcoming. His voice felt unnatural, as if he were speaking to a stranger rather than someone who needed help. But he wasn't sure how to act around Lyra. She was different. She was so guarded, so distant, and that made Raylan feel unsure. Lyra didn't reply. She simply walked to the window and looked outside. Her hands rested at her sides, fingers trembling slightly, but she quickly hid the movement. It was as if she didn't want to show any weakness. Raylan watched her for a moment, unsure of what to do next. "I'll be in the other room if you need anything," he said, his voice quieter this time. Lyra didn't turn to acknowledge him. She didn't need to. Raylan could feel the coldness between them, like an invisible wall that had been built the moment they left the palace. He sighed and walked into the small kitchen area. There was nothing special about the place. It was functional, just like the house itself. Raylan didn't care much about the details. His thoughts kept drifting back to Lyra. He knew she had been abandoned, but he didn't know why. She was a princess. Her father should have cared for her. Instead, she had been sent away to a remote colony, left to fend for herself. Raylan couldn't understand it. He couldn't understand why someone would do that to their own child. As Raylan stood at the counter, preparing something simple to eat, the door opened again. A woman, tall and dressed in the uniform of the colony, entered the house. She looked at Raylan with a neutral expression, but her eyes flickered to Lyra, still standing by the window. "Ambassador Carter," the woman said, her voice polite but firm. "I was told you would be bringing the princess. We weren't expecting her today." Raylan turned around, frowning. "She's not here for a formal visit. She's staying with me for a while." The woman's eyes shifted uneasily. "Of course, I wasn't expecting a royal guest to arrive without notice. But the people here are not used to such visitors." Raylan knew what she meant. The people of the colony had their own lives, their own concerns. They weren't interested in the royal politics of distant planets. They had no reason to care about Lyra's presence here, and Raylan had no intention of forcing them to. But he also knew that this was not going to be an easy situation. "I understand," Raylan replied, his voice calm. "I'll make sure Lyra stays out of the way." The woman nodded, but her gaze lingered on Lyra. She was still standing by the window, her back straight, her posture cold. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly before she turned and left the house without another word. Raylan stood in silence for a moment, watching Lyra. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. She was completely still, as if she had built up a wall around herself to keep everyone out. It was a strange thing to witness. Most people, when they arrived in a new place, tried to explore, to make themselves comfortable. Lyra, however, seemed to want to stay as far away from everything as possible. Raylan walked over to her, standing beside the window, his voice soft. "It's going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it to her or to himself. Lyra didn't respond. Her gaze was still focused on the distant stars, her face unreadable. But Raylan could see something in her eyes. It was pain, a deep, painful sadness that she didn't want to show. He could feel it in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. "I know you don't trust me," Raylan continued, his words slow and deliberate. "But I'm not going to hurt you. You don't have to be afraid here." Lyra finally turned her head, but only slightly. She looked at him out of the corner of her eye, her lips pressed tightly together. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice flat. "I just don't care." Raylan's heart sank. He didn't know what to say. He could tell she was shutting him out. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to be with him. She didn't want anyone to care about her. "I'll leave you alone for now," Raylan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra nodded once, still staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. Raylan turned and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. He sat down on the couch, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? Lyra didn't want help. She didn't want to be saved. She didn't want anyone to care. But Raylan couldn't just leave her here. He couldn't just walk away like everyone else had. He wasn't sure how to help her, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to give up on her. Lyra's secret strength. The days that followed felt heavy for Raylan. He had done his best to make Lyra feel welcome, but no matter what he did, she remained distant, cold, and silent. She didn't want his help. She didn't want to be around him. It was as if she was locked inside herself, a prisoner of her own thoughts and memories. Raylan couldn't understand why she pushed him away so much. She was a princess, a royal, and yet she seemed so alone. Each day, she would stay in her room, hardly ever leaving, except for brief moments when she'd come out to eat or to stare out the window, lost in thought. Raylan never pushed her to talk, but it frustrated him. He wanted to break through to her, to understand what was going on in her head. He wanted to help. It was late one evening when things finally began to change. Raylan was sitting at the small table, cleaning his blaster, the only real task that kept him busy. His thoughts kept drifting back to Lyra, wondering what she was doing. Just as he was finishing up, he heard a sound coming from the room down the hall. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the air. He listened carefully, his heart racing. The sound came again. This time, it was clearer. It was a voice, a faint cry of pain. Raylan's first instinct was to get up and check on her, but as he stood and walked to the door, he hesitated. What if she didn't want him around? What if she didn't want anyone to know how she was truly feeling? He opened the door slowly, stepping into the hallway, and the sound of sobbing grew louder. It was Lyra. She was crying, her voice broken and raw. Raylan's heart ached. He knew she was suffering, but he hadn't expected this. He walked toward her room, pausing just outside the door. The sobs continued, and Raylan felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but he couldn't just leave her like this. Without knocking, he pushed the door open. Lyra was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her face buried in her hands. She didn't hear him come in. For a moment, Raylan stood there, unsure of what to do or say. But when Lyra looked up, her eyes were filled with raw emotion, pain, anger, and something else Raylan couldn't quite place. "Lyra," Raylan said softly, stepping into the room. Lyra quickly wiped her eyes, as if embarrassed to be seen like this. "I don't need your pity," she snapped, her voice shaky but sharp. "Leave me alone." Raylan didn't back down. "I'm not pitying you," he said quietly. "I'm just here for you. You don't have to go through this alone." Lyra's gaze shifted, and for the first time since he met her, he saw a crack in her tough exterior. She looked at him with disbelief, like she couldn't quite believe what he was saying. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if she was weighing something in her mind. "I'm not weak," Lyra said suddenly, her voice firm and steady. "I've been through worse. I've survived worse." Raylan was surprised by her words. He thought she had been broken, lost in the past. But now he could see something different in her eyes, a strength that he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't the kind of strength that came from physical power, but something deeper, something harder to break. "I know you're strong," Raylan said gently. "But you don't have to do this by yourself. You don't have to hide it. Whatever happened, whatever you've been through, you don't have to carry it alone." Lyra stood up suddenly, her fists clenched at her sides. "I'm not weak," she shouted, her voice sharp. "I'm not some fragile thing that needs protecting. I don't need anyone." Raylan's heart raced, but he stayed calm. He had seen this kind of reaction before. It was the defense mechanism of someone who had been hurt too many times, someone who was afraid to let anyone close. "I never said you were weak," Raylan replied. "I never said you needed protection. But you don't have to keep everything inside. Sometimes talking about it helps, and sometimes letting others in makes you stronger." Lyra's eyes flickered, uncertainty crossing her face. For the first time, Raylan saw a hint of doubt in her expression. She seemed torn between her pride and her pain, between the need to hide her hurt and the desire to be understood. "I've been through things you couldn't even imagine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've seen things, lost people. I was thrown away like nothing. I don't trust anyone. I can't." Raylan stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to trust everyone. But you don't have to carry all of that by yourself. There are people who want to help, Lyra. You don't have to be alone." For a long moment, Lyra didn't speak. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes distant as she looked away. But then, slowly, she took a deep breath and lowered her shoulders. "I've been alone for so long," she murmured. "I don't know how to trust." Raylan nodded, understanding more than she knew. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." Lyra looked at him, and for the first time, Raylan saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a hint of hope, though small and fragile. She wasn't completely broken. There was strength inside her, a strength she had been hiding, even from herself. Raylan smiled gently. "You don't have to figure it all out now. Just take one step at a time. And when you're ready, I'll be here." Lyra didn't say anything else, but she didn't turn away either. For the first time since she had arrived, she didn't look so alone. Raylan knew they still had a long road ahead of them, But seeing the change in her eyes, even just a little, gave him hope. Lyra's secret strength was waiting to be unlocked. He just had to help her find it. The Council's plan backfires. The Galactic Council had always seen Raylan as nothing more than a pawn, someone they could push around and use for their own gain. They had laughed when they heard that he had inherited the king's unwanted daughter, Lyra. They saw her as weak, a liability to be tossed aside. And they believed that Raylan, a simple human soldier, would never be able to handle the responsibility of protecting her. But what the Council didn't know was that Raylan was not the kind of man they thought he was. He wasn't just a soldier. He was someone who cared, someone who had a strength of his own. And as for Lyra, she wasn't as helpless as they believed. The Council had made their move with an air of confidence, thinking they could control the situation. They had thought that by sending Lyra to Raylan, they could undermine the king and keep the princess out of their way. They figured Raylan would fail, that he would be forced to give her back, or perhaps give up on her entirely. But they were wrong. As the days passed, Raylan and Lyra grew closer, not in the way the Council had expected. They didn't fall in love, not yet at least, but they developed a bond. Raylan started to understand Lyra's pain, her fears, and most of all, her strength. He saw past her walls, and he was determined to help her find her place in this new world. The Council didn't realize the danger of underestimating someone like Raylan. They thought that because he was human, he would be easy to manipulate, but Raylan had spent his life fighting for what was right. He wasn't someone who could be controlled so easily. And Lyra, the unwanted princess, had proven time and time again that she wasn't just some fragile, broken thing. She had a fire inside her that could not be extinguished. One day, the Council called for a meeting to discuss the situation. Their voices echoed through the grand hall as they argued over the fate of Lyra and Raylan. The head of the Council, an old alien named Torin, stood at the front, his sharp eyes focused on the holographic display showing Raylan and Lyra's current location. "This is a failure," Torin declared, his voice cold and calculating. "The human has done nothing but waste our time. He has failed to understand the importance of this task. The princess is nothing but a liability. We must take action." A murmur of agreement passed through the Council members, but one voice rose above the others. "We should send someone to take her back," said a tall, armored alien named Thrax. "We can't allow a human to control her. The princess is the key to our power. She must be returned to us." Torin nodded, his expression unreadable. "Agreed. It is time to put an end to this. We will send a team to retrieve the princess and deal with the human." As the meeting continued, they made their plans. The Council believed that by sending a team of elite soldiers, they could easily take Lyra back, force her into submission, and eliminate any threat Raylan posed. But what they didn't know was that they were making a grave mistake. They underestimated not just Raylan, but also Lyra. Back on the small planet where Raylan and Lyra were staying, the tension in the air was palpable. Raylan had no idea that the Council was plotting against them. He had been focused on helping Lyra find her strength, teaching her how to trust again. But Lyra could sense something was off. She had grown quiet and distant once more, sensing the storm that was about to break. One evening, as they sat together, Lyra spoke up. "Raylan," she said softly, her voice uncertain. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Raylan looked at her, concern in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Lyra whispered. "It's like a storm is coming, and I'm not sure we can outrun it." Raylan's heart raced. He had been too focused on her healing, too distracted by their own struggles to notice the danger closing in on them. But he trusted Lyra. If she felt something was wrong, then he knew they had to prepare. The next morning, they were not surprised when a ship landed nearby. It wasn't a regular transport, but a military ship. Raylan's instincts kicked in immediately. The Council's soldiers had arrived. Raylan and Lyra quickly gathered their things and flowed into the dense woods surrounding their small shelter. The soldiers wouldn't catch them so easily. Raylan had been trained for situations like this, and with Lyra's help, they would survive. She might not have been a soldier, but she had her own unique strength, her quick thinking and sharp instincts. She knew how to survive, just like Raylan did. As they ran, the soldiers landed and began searching the area. They weren't aware of how close they were to Raylan and Lyra, who had taken cover in the thick trees. Raylan kept his breath steady, knowing they couldn't afford to make a sound. "I won't go back," Lyra whispered to him, her eyes fierce. "I won't let them take me." Raylan nodded, his grip tightening around his blaster. "I won't let them take you either." The soldiers searched the area, but they couldn't find any trace of the pair. Raylan's training had paid off. He knew how to stay hidden, how to blend into the surroundings, and how to stay one step ahead. It was only a matter of time before the soldiers gave up and left, realizing their plan had backfired. Raylan and Lyra had outsmarted them once again. As the soldiers departed, Lyra looked at Raylan, a small, tired smile on her face. "We won this round, didn't we?" Raylan smiled back. "We sure did." And with that, they disappeared into the wilderness, ready for whatever came next. The council's plan had failed, and they had no idea that the real battle was just beginning. The fight for the future. Raylan and Lyra had learned the hard way that nothing was ever simple. The council's plan to take Lyra back had failed, but their troubles were far from over. As the days passed, the two of them realized the full scope of the danger they were in. The council would not give up easily. They had only just begun. The wilderness surrounding them was peaceful, but it was also dangerous. Raylan had taken the time to teach Lyra survival skills, but they both knew that living out here was not a permanent solution. The council's military presence was growing, and sooner or later, they would track them down. They needed a plan, a way to fight back. One night, as they sat by their small fire, Raylan looked at Lyra, her eyes glowing in the light of the flames. He could see how much she had changed in the time they'd spent together. She was no longer the frightened princess who had been sent away. Now she was strong, determined, and ready to take control of her own fate. "Lyra," Raylan said, his voice serious, "we can't keep running forever. If we want a chance at a future, we need to take the fight to the council." Lyra nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. She had spent her whole life in the shadow of others, her fate controlled by the council and her father. Now she had the chance to make her own decisions. "What do you suggest we do?" she asked, her voice calm, but with a fire underneath. Raylan hesitated for a moment. He had been in many battles, but this was different. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for something bigger. They were fighting for a future where Lyra, and people like her, could be free. "We need to find allies," Raylan said finally. "We can't take on the whole council alone. We need to reach out to those who might be willing to stand against them. There are groups, people who have suffered under the council's rule. We just have to find them." Lyra's eyes lit up. "You think there are others who want to fight back?" "I'm sure of it," Raylan said, nodding. "But it won't be easy. We'll have to be careful. The council has eyes everywhere." They both fell into silence, each lost in thought. For a while, it had felt like they were on the run with no real purpose. But now, the weight of their situation was clear. They weren't just running from the council. They were fighting for a new future, one where they could be free of their control. The next morning, Raylan and Lyra began their journey. They had no idea where to start, but Raylan had learned enough about the galaxy's politics during his time as a soldier to know that there were groups out there who hated the council. It was only a matter of finding them. As they traveled from one planet to the next, they faced numerous challenges. Their ship was old and not built for long journeys, but it was all they had. They had to be careful not to draw attention. The council's spies were everywhere, and they knew that if they weren't cautious, they would be caught. After a few weeks, they finally found a lead, A group of rebels on a planet called Arden had been fighting the Council for years. They were small, scattered, and mostly operating in the shadows. But they were known to have connections to powerful people, and they had a reputation for taking down Council installations. Raylan and Lyra made contact with a man named Tarek, the leader of the rebels. He was a rugged man, with a scar running down the side of his face, and his eyes were filled with distrust. "You two want to join the fight against the Council?" Tarek asked, eyeing them both carefully. "What makes you think we'll help you?" Lyra stepped forward, her posture straight and firm. "I'm the king's daughter. The Council wants me back, and I won't go. I want to fight. I want to help you destroy them." Tarek looked at her for a long time before his gaze shifted to Raylan. "And you?" he asked. "I'm a soldier," Raylan said simply. "I fought battles for others my whole life. Now, I'm fighting for something that matters." Tarek nodded slowly. "All right, I'll help you. But this won't be easy. The Council has more power than you can imagine." Raylan and Lyra spent the next few days with Tarek, learning about the rebels' operations. They weren't a large group, but they were skilled and determined. They had already made small victories against the Council, but they were nowhere near strong enough to take them down. They needed more resources, more fighters, and more support. The plan was simple, but dangerous. The rebels had gathered intelligence on a Council base located on a nearby moon. The base was a storage facility for advanced weapons the rebels could use to level the playing field. Raylan and Lyra would lead a small team of rebels to infiltrate the base, steal the weapons, and get out without being caught. The mission was risky, but it was their best chance. Raylan knew that if they succeeded, it would be a huge blow to the Council. But if they failed, he didn't want to think about failure. That night, as they prepared for the mission, Lyra came to him. "Raylan," she said softly, her voice filled with determination, "if this works, we could change everything. For both of us." Raylan looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. He had seen the change in her, from a scared princess to a warrior ready to take control of her destiny. This fight was no longer just about survival. It was about hope, a future where they could be free, not just from the Council, but from everything that had held them down. Together, they would fight, and together, they would change the future. A new beginning. Raylan and Lyra stood on the edge of the battlefield, the smoke of recent conflict still rising in the distance. The sounds of battle had faded, but the tension remained. It had been a long, hard fight, but they had won. The rebels, now with the weapons they had fought for, had taken down the Council's base. It was a victory, but it was only the beginning. Lyra looked at Raylan, her heart beating faster. It had been a long time since she had felt this way, strong, alive, and in control of her own fate. The Council, the kingdom, all the people who had treated her like an object. None of it mattered anymore. She had chosen her path. She had chosen Raylan and the fight for a future where people like her were free to live their lives without fear or control. "Raylan," she said softly, her voice full of emotion, "we did it." Raylan turned to her, a small proud smile on his face. He had seen her grow from the scared, uncertain princess into a confident woman and a powerful fighter. It wasn't just the mission they had won. It was everything that they had overcome together. "We did it," he agreed. His voice was filled with pride and relief. "But this is just the first step. There's more to do." The fight had not been easy. The mission to steal the weapons had been dangerous, and the consequences of failure had been clear. Yet, Raylan and Lyra, along with the rebels, had managed to succeed. They had taken down a major stronghold of the Council, and now, with the stolen weapons in their hands, they had a fighting chance. The rebellion was stronger now. The Council had lost one of its key bases, and its hold over the galaxy had weakened. But Raylan and Lyra knew the war wasn't over. The Council wouldn't just give up. They would retaliate, strike back, and try to crush any sign of rebellion. But this time, things were different. Lyra was no longer the helpless princess locked away in a tower. She had become the symbol of change, of hope for the people who had suffered under the council's rule. And Raylan, the soldier who had once fought only for survival, was now fighting for something more. He was fighting for freedom. Raylan and Lyra knew that to win the war, they would need more allies. The battle for the galaxy's future had just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. They would need to gather support from other planets, other groups, and bring together the forces that were ready to stand against the Council. As they made their way back to the rebel base, Lyra looked around at the others, fighters, leaders, people who had risked everything to stand against the Council. They had all given their trust to her, and they were counting on her to lead them to victory. She couldn't afford to let them down. Turek, the leader of the rebels, came up to them as they walked through the camp. "We've made history today," he said, his voice heavy with respect. "But there's still more to do. The Council will come after us with everything they have. We need to be ready." Lyra nodded. "I know, but we have something they don't, hope, and that's stronger than any weapon they have." Tarek smiled, clearly impressed. "You've changed, Lyra. I'm not sure the Council ever expected you to be this strong." She didn't respond, but inside, she felt a new confidence growing. It was true. The girl who had once been the unwanted daughter of a king was now someone people looked up to. She had a future, one she had fought for, one she had built herself. And it wasn't just about fighting the Council anymore. It was about creating a world where people could be free. Raylan stood beside her, a silent promise in his eyes. They had come this far together, and they would continue to fight side by side. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The days that followed were filled with plans. Raylan and Lyra worked with the rebels to organize, strategize, and prepare for the next phase of the fight. They knew the Council would strike back, but they also knew that they had already changed the game. The balance of power had shifted, and it was no longer the Council that held the upper hand. Lyra found herself taking on more responsibilities than she had ever imagined. She was no longer a princess waiting to be saved. She was a leader, making decisions that would affect the lives of thousands. Raylan helped guide her through the tough choices, but it was clear that she was no longer the same person she had been when they first met. She had become a force of her own. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their camp, Raylan looked at Lyra and smiled. "You've come a long way, you know that." Lyra smiled back. "So have you. I couldn't have done this without you." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars in the sky. It felt like the beginning of something new, a new chapter in their lives. They had been through so much, danger, fear, and uncertainty. But now, they had a chance to shape the future. The galaxy was changing, and Raylan and Lyra would be there to lead the way. Together, they had found something stronger than any enemy they could face: hope. And with that hope, they would fight for a future where freedom wasn't a dream, but a reality. A new beginning had begun.